Welcome to Betrayal and Revenge. I'm your storyteller, and today I'll take you on a journey of secrets, lies, and payback. Make sure you stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss how it all unfolds. And when it's over, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. There were moments, even now, when Helen Price tried to convince herself that it had never happened, that the coffee had never flown across the kitchen like a burning arc of humiliation, that her daughter's voice hadn't cracked with rage as she screamed for a credit card she didn't own, hadn't earned, and no longer respected. But reality has a weight that memory cannot soften. And no matter how many times Helen rewound the tape in her mind, the sting of heat and betrayal on her chest remained just as vivid. It wasn't just coffee. It was the culmination of years, a lifetime really, of trying to buy peace inside a home that had long stopped offering it in return. At 62, Helen had never imagined her retirement would look like this. Bruised pride, stained sweaters, and a daughter who treated her not as a parent, but as an open wallet with a voice she no longer cared to hear. Her friends had called her lucky. Single mother, 2 jobs, no support system, and yet she raised a daughter who went to private school, wore braces at 13, and spent summers at language camps in France while Helen skipped vacations to work overtime at the hospital. She was an ICU nurse for 38 years, a woman who could steady her hands in the face of death, but couldn't stop them from trembling when her grown child hurled a paper cup full of hazelnut latte across the room in a tantrum that should have belonged to a teenager. It began long before that moment. Helen knew that. She just hadn't seen it clearly, not until it was too late. Melanie had always been spirited, sensitive, prone to dramatics. As a child, she wailed at the smallest injustice. Cracked popsicles, bedtime routines, a friend refusing to share a toy. Helen had soothed her with lullabies and gentle negotiations, always choosing comfort over conflict. She told herself that giving her daughter everything she hadn't had growing up, a room of her own, organic snacks, piano lessons, the latest electronics, was the key to raising a confident, unbroken woman. And maybe for a while it had worked. But somewhere in the soft accommodations, the lines began to blur. Respect slowly gave way to entitlement. Gratitude curdled into expectation. And Helen, too exhausted by double shifts and single parenting, kept saying yes, even when her gut whispered no. The first major warning sign came the year Melanie dropped out of college mid-semester without telling her. Helen only found out when she noticed the tuition refund in her bank statement, money she had drained from her retirement account to cover the semester. Melanie offered no apology, only a shrug and a vague comment about not being inspired anymore. Helen didn't press. She was too afraid of pushing her daughter further away. In the years that followed, Melanie floated from one interest to another. Fashion merchandising, holistic wellness, photography, a lifestyle blog that lasted exactly 8 posts. Each new dream came with startup costs, equipment, registration fees, travel, and Helen always paid. Sometimes Melanie promised to pay her back, sometimes she didn't bother. The conversations began to shift around Helen's income. "You make good money," Melanie would say, lips pursed. "You always told me nurses were underpaid and overworked, but clearly you've managed just fine." As if Helen's modest success, achieved through decades of sacrifice, was evidence that her labor had never been that hard to begin with. By the time Melanie turned 30, she had never held a job longer than 6 months. She lived in a trendy downtown apartment Helen helped her secure, drove a car Helen co-signed for, and used Helen's credit card for emergencies. Though those emergencies somehow always included subscription boxes, new shoes, and brunch with bottomless mimosas. Helen told herself it was temporary, that her daughter just needed to find her passion, that the world was harder now for young people. But inside, the cracks were spreading. She was tired. Not just tired like after a long shift, tired in her soul. And then came the afternoon that turned exhaustion into finality. It had been a Tuesday. Helen had stopped by Melanie's apartment to drop off a package, some items that had been mistakenly delivered to her house instead. Melanie was in a mood from the moment she opened the door. The internet had gone out. Her phone screen had cracked. Her landlord had emailed about a missed utility bill. Helen offered sympathy, asked if she needed help fixing the router, suggested putting off a shopping trip until the weekend. And that's when Melanie snapped. She demanded the credit card, her card, the one with Helen's name, the one Helen had slowly begun weaning her off of, reducing the limit, paying it down in secret. She demanded access immediately. Because this is your fault, Mom. You raised me to expect better than this. When Helen said no, not cruelly, not loudly, just no, Melanie's eyes narrowed. Her voice shook. Her fingers curled around the paper coffee cup on the counter. And then it flew. The lid popped off midair. Warm liquid splattered across Helen's chest, soaking into the front of her blouse, staining the skin beneath. The silence after was louder than the scream that had preceded it. Melanie didn't apologize. She stared. For a moment Helen thought she might laugh. But she didn't. She just turned away and muttered something Helen couldn't hear. That night, Helen drove home in silence, her blouse still damp, her breath coming shallow and cold. And the next morning, she opened a new checking account. She called a lawyer. And for the first time in 30 years, she began to imagine a future in which she would no longer beg her daughter to love her in return. Helen didn't sleep that night. Her body lay still, cocooned under her quilt, but her mind clawed at itself in circles. She stared at the ceiling until the shadows turned gray, the kind of colorless dawn that felt more like defeat than beginning. The coffee stain on her blouse had dried stiff against the laundry sink. She didn't wash it. Not yet. Part of her wanted to preserve it, as if the act of cleaning it would be some kind of absolution for Melanie. And Helen wasn't ready to forgive. By mid-morning, she had made 3 decisions. First, she transferred her remaining funds, savings, emergency reserves, everything not tied up in her pension, into a new account at a different bank. One with no joint access, no shared online logins, and no cards that had ever been in Melanie's hands. Second, she cut up the card her daughter had used for years. The scissors hesitated for a moment above the embossed numbers. She remembered when she'd first applied for it, back when Melanie was starting community college and needed a little backup, just in case. She had told herself it was temporary, that it was what good mothers did. Now the blade snapped through the plastic in 2 clean final bites. And third, she called her lawyer. Not because she wanted to sue her daughter, not because she wanted revenge, but because Helen had spent a lifetime organizing other people's emergencies, nursing strangers through pain, and putting out fires that weren't hers. And now, for the first time, she wanted to be ready before the next one started. The attorney was calm, efficient. A woman named Carla Wu who spoke like she had seen hundreds of stories just like Helen's. Mothers who had mistaken sacrifice for parenting, daughters who mistook generosity for debt. She walked Helen through the steps. Power of attorney documents, healthcare directives, changes to her will. Helen hadn't realized Melanie was still listed as her sole emergency contact. That changed too. And then came the hard part, telling Melanie. Helen didn't do it in person. She couldn't. She drafted an email instead. Simple, respectful, detached. She explained that she was taking steps to restructure her finances, and that she would no longer be covering any non-essential expenses. That she loved her daughter, but that their relationship needed boundaries, firm, clear ones for both their sakes. She wrote and rewrote it 4 times before sending it. Deleted the part where she mentioned the coffee. Deleted the part where she said, "You scared me." She didn't want to fight. She just wanted to breathe. The response came 23 minutes later. A single sentence. "So you're cutting me off? After everything I gave up for you?" Helen stared at it for several seconds, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Gave up for me? What had Melanie ever given up, other than another person's dignity? The messages poured in after that. First texts, then voice notes, then screenshots of overdue bills, links to apartment listings, photos of a cracked phone screen with captions like, "Guess I'll just walk to job interviews now, right?" But there were no job interviews. Helen knew that. There was no job. Melanie hadn't worked in over a year. That weekend, Melanie showed up at her mother's house without calling. She banged on the door loud enough for the neighbor's dog to bark. When Helen opened it, half hoping, half dreading, her daughter stormed in without permission and dropped a backpack on the floor. "You want me to move back in? Fine," she snapped. "Let's see how long it takes before you come crawling with your guilt." Helen froze. "I didn't say you had to move back in. You just don't want to help me anymore. Fine. I'll rot here. You'll watch." And that's exactly what Melanie did for the next 3 days. She stayed in Helen's guest room, ordered takeout she couldn't pay for, left wet towels on the bathroom floor, and slammed every door she touched. Helen tried to talk to her once. She offered to discuss a realistic budget, to help Melanie apply for jobs, to help her restructure her debts. Melanie laughed in her face. "You think this is about money," she snapped. "It's about control. You don't like that I'm not your little project anymore. You hate that I have a life without you." "You don't have a life," Helen replied before she could stop herself. "You have a tab." The silence that followed that sentence was sharper than any scream. Melanie packed her things that night.
No hugs. No tears.
She slammed the front door so hard that the picture frames in the hallway tilted sideways. Helen didn't fix them. She sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and for the first time in years, let herself cry not for what was breaking, but for what had never really been whole to begin with. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow, painful detox. Helen moved through her days with the dull throb of someone coming down from a lifetime addiction. Except the drug hadn't been alcohol, or painkillers, or even comfort. It had been hope. Hope that her daughter would one day become the person Helen always believed she could be. Hope that love, given freely and without limit, would somehow teach respect in return. But now, Helen was learning that hope without boundaries was just self-harm dressed in softer clothes. Melanie's silence didn't last long. She returned not with apologies but with escalation. Emails to relatives painting Helen as unstable and possibly suffering from early dementia. Vague, performative social media posts about narcissistic parents and generational trauma. She even showed up at Helen's old workplace, the hospital she had retired from just months earlier, asking former colleagues if they'd seen any signs of mental decline. The messages became crueler. Screenshots from old family albums posted with bitter captions. "She raised me to believe love came with strings." Friends of friends began messaging Helen, unsure what was real. Some offered support. Others simply vanished. Helen stopped responding, not out of weakness but out of preservation. She blocked Melanie on all platforms, changed her phone number, alerted her bank to freeze any suspicious transactions. She filed a no trespass request with local authorities after Melanie attempted to enter her home while she was out. A neighbor had caught it on the Ring camera. The officer who took her statement was kind but curious. "It's usually the other way around," he said gently. "We see parents trying to force themselves into their children's lives, not children forcing their way back into their parents' wallet." Helen smiled sadly. "I think it's the same thing, really. Just upside down." She canceled the co-signed car loan. Melanie's vehicle was repossessed 2 weeks later. She received 3 angry voicemails that day. Accusations, sobbing, threats, silence. Helen saved them. Not to hurt herself, but to remind herself how far she'd come. For years she'd believed that walking away from Melanie, refusing to give her what she asked for, meant abandoning her. But now she understood the truth. She hadn't been mothering her daughter. She'd been enabling a performance. The role of the loving mom had become a mask she wore to avoid the guilt of saying no. But that mask was suffocating her. She attended a support group for parents in similar situations. Estranged families of adult children. Felt clinical at first. Cold. She nearly walked out after the first session. But then an older man, gray-haired, shaking slightly, shared a story of his son draining his savings under the promise of launching a startup. When the money ran out, the son vanished. "He never wanted me," the man said. "He wanted my insurance." Helen didn't speak that night, but she returned the next week. She started journaling. Her therapist encouraged her to write a letter to Melanie, not to send but to say everything she never had the space to say. The page stayed blank for hours. But then the words came. "You used to hold my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. You trusted me to feed you, dress you, defend you. And I did. I always did. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a purse. I love you. But I can't keep bleeding for a version of you that doesn't exist." She wept after finishing it. But it wasn't grief. Not anymore. It was relief. Autumn settled into the trees outside her window. The days grew shorter, the air quieter. Helen planted chrysanthemums in the front garden, something she hadn't done in years. She joined a watercolor class on Thursdays. She started sleeping through the night again. And one afternoon, while organizing her closet, she found the blouse, the one with the coffee stain. She held it in her hands for a long time. The fabric had stiffened into memory. She didn't throw it away. Not yet. But she folded it neatly and placed it at the bottom of a box marked, "Not mine to fix anymore." It began with a summons. A thin envelope in the mail, no return address, just her name typed in stiff block letters. Helen recognized the format before she opened it. Legal. Formal. The kind of letter that didn't ask but ordered. Her breath caught as she tore the flap open. Inside, a court notice. Melanie was filing for unlawful eviction and emotional harm, claiming that Helen had abandoned her daughter during a time of known financial instability, resulting in undue psychological distress. The words blurred for a moment as Helen reread them. Eviction? Her daughter had never been on the lease, had never paid rent, had never in fact been a tenant at all. It was absurd.
Offensive.
And yet, deeply humiliating. The included affidavit featured screenshots of text exchanges, selective excerpts from old emails, and even a distorted image of Helen's retirement party invitation, annotated by Melanie to suggest a history of exclusion and intentional sabotage. Helen sat down, the letter trembling in her hand. The ache in her chest was no longer emotional. It was physical. A dull, crushing pressure beneath her ribs. By the time she reached Carla Wu, her attorney, she was nearly hysterical. "She's trying to sue me," Helen said, voice cracking. Carla remained calm. She'd seen worse, apparently. "It won't go anywhere," she assured her. "But we'll respond. Officially. And firmly." What followed were two of the most exhausting weeks Helen had ever lived through. And she had lived through enough. Melanie didn't stop at the lawsuit. She called Child Protective Services, alleging that Helen had a history of verbal abuse and possible neglect back when she was a minor. The claims were too old to pursue formally, but the investigation was launched anyway. 2 social workers visited Helen's home, asked questions in polite voices with grave eyes, examined old family photos like they might find trauma curled into the corners of the frame. Helen answered everything. Truthfully. Calmly. Then she cried for an hour after they left. Not because she feared them, but because her daughter had become someone who could weaponize her own childhood. Then came the credit report notifications. Helen's name had been used in an attempt to open a new line of credit. Twice. The bank flagged the applications as suspicious and blocked them, but the damage was emotional. Helen sat with Carla in a dim conference room downtown, staring at paperwork she never imagined needing to file: fraud claims, restraining orders, statements of non-consent. And still there was more. Melanie messaged Helen's sister, her old co-workers, even her high school friends on Facebook. The posts became darker. "My mother has rewritten history to punish me. I'm being financially and emotionally abused by the person who raised me." Some were accompanied by old photos of them together, smiling, hugging, the illusion of closeness now weaponized to frame a lie. What hurt most was not the words themselves but the people who believed them. Some replied with quiet condolences. Some offered support. Others blocked Helen altogether. Even her best friend Margaret called with hesitation in her voice. "Helen, I don't want to pry," she said. "But is everything okay with Melanie? I just saw something unsettling." Helen almost denied everything. Almost said it was complicated. Or just a misunderstanding. But then she stopped herself. "No," she said plainly. "She's lying. Because I stopped paying her bills." The silence on the other end was heavy. Then Margaret exhaled. "Good for you," she said. "It's about time someone told her no." Still, the damage crept into Helen's life like mold in the walls. Quiet. Invisible until it touched everything. Her days became full of paperwork, passwords, appointments. She updated every account she had. Installed cameras around her house. Changed her locks. She slept with her phone on the pillow beside her, heart pounding at every unexpected noise. But she also began to change. Something inside her that had always been soft, pliable, eager to please, hardened. Not into bitterness but into steel. She began walking every morning. Read books on boundaries, on adult children who manipulate, on the difference between love and obligation. For the first time in her life, she began talking about Melanie without shame. Not to gossip, but to tell the truth. She shared the court documents with her group at Estranged Families. Several nodded with recognition. One woman even whispered, "My daughter tried to have me declared mentally unfit, just to get my condo." Helen stopped feeling alone. The court ultimately dismissed Melanie's claims. The judge, unimpressed with the evidence, issued a brief statement. "This appears to be a personal grievance disguised as legal action. Case dismissed." No apology followed. No letter.
No acknowledgement.
But something inside Helen had shifted forever. She no longer saw herself as a victim, not even as a mother whose child had gone astray. She saw herself, finally, as a woman who had survived a war she never asked to fight, and who, against every generational instinct, had chosen not to sacrifice herself on the altar of motherhood. And she was ready to fight back. Helen always believed revenge was an ugly word, sharp at the edges, soaked in bitterness. It sounded like something theatrical and cruel, something loud. But now, standing in her attorney's office with a notarized envelope in her hand, she understood. True revenge was not rage. It was removal. Not punishment but erasure. Started with the will. For decades, Helen had intended to leave everything to Melanie. She had no other children, no partner, no siblings who remained close. Everything, her home, her modest retirement savings, even her grandmother's heirloom china, was earmarked for her only daughter. She had believed it was what mothers did. What else was all the sacrifice for, if not to pass something down? But now, that idea felt not only outdated but dangerous. Rewarding cruelty with inheritance was like setting fire to your own legacy and calling it tradition. So she rewrote everything. Slowly, carefully. She left a portion of her estate to charity, a local scholarship fund for first-generation nursing students, and a women's shelter she quietly donated to for years. She designated her house to go to a longtime friend, a retired librarian who had no family and had always sent her thank you notes for every holiday card. The bulk of her savings she placed in a trust. Not for Melanie, for herself. Structured with strict clauses. Healthcare access, legal protection, power of attorney handled by a neutral party.
No loopholes.
No emergency clauses.
No backdoors.
When the paperwork was finalized, Carla slid the folder across the table and asked, "Do you want to notify your daughter formally?" Helen smiled.
No.
Let her find out the way I found out about the lawsuit. Through someone else's voice. She began documenting everything. Not because she intended to publish her story, but because she needed a record. A written archive that no one could distort or delete. She printed copies of the court dismissal, kept a journal of Melanie's harassment, saved every message, every screenshot. Then she took it further. She reached out to every mutual financial tie and severed it. Removed her name from the car loan. Disconnected from joint credit histories. Notified her pension provider that no one, not even family, was authorized to act on her behalf. And finally, she took the most painful step. She visited the old storage unit she'd been paying for in Melanie's name. Inside were boxes Helen hadn't seen in years. Baby clothes, school projects, framed photographs of holidays long gone. Melanie had stored them there after moving into her downtown apartment and never paid a cent. Helen had kept the payments going for sentiment, for hope, for a memory of love that, now she understood, had been mostly hers alone. She went through them one by one. Some things she kept. A photo of a smiling toddler in a sun hat. A handwritten Mother's Day card from second grade with lopsided hearts and glitter. But most of it she left behind. She canceled the lease on the unit and donated the contents to a local church, asking them not to list her name. It felt like walking through the ruins of a burned-out house, choosing what was salvageable and stepping over the rest. Melanie, of course, didn't stay silent. The moment she discovered the storage unit was gone, the voicemails began again. Screaming. Threats. Cries. Then silence. Then more screaming. The emotional roller coaster she used to ride in sympathy. Then guilt. Now it passed through Helen like distant thunder. She stopped answering altogether. Melanie showed up at her door once more. This time it was night. Helen didn't open the door. She watched her through the peephole. Eyes wild, mascara smudged, pacing on the porch with clenched fists and a cracked phone in her hand. She rang the bell again and again. Pounded once. Then slumped to the ground. Helen called the police. She didn't open the door. The next morning, her mailbox had been stuffed full, notes torn from spiral notebooks pleading, "You're my mother. Don't do this. I have nothing. This is cruel." Helen read them all. Then she burned them in the fireplace. Revenge wasn't rage. It wasn't even justice. It was choosing not to answer the knock. It was watching the woman you raised become the woman who destroyed you, and not offering her a single match to light the next fire. Helen enrolled in a weekend retreat for older women recovering from toxic family dynamics. They met in a lodge near the mountains without cell service, without distractions. There she sat in circles with women whose sons stole their houses, whose daughters drained their pensions, whose family photos looked warm but whose memories were cold. They cried. They laughed. They admitted the ugliest truths. And Helen, for the first time in her life, said it out loud. "I don't love her the way I used to. I think I love the child she was, not the woman she became." No one flinched. No one judged her. And that night she slept 8 hours straight for the first time in years. When she returned home, her house was quiet, clean, safe, and finally hers. Helen had always imagined freedom as something loud, triumphant. The rush of wind in your hair as you drove away from something that once broke you. The slam of a door, the crack of thunder behind a declaration. "I'm done." But now, as she sipped tea in her kitchen on a calm November morning, she realized freedom was silence. It was space. And more than anything, it was peace that asked for nothing in return. The house had changed subtly. It wasn't just the locks or the security system, or the absence of extra toothbrushes in the guest bathroom. It was in the arrangement of furniture, the color of the new curtains, the scent of lavender instead of expensive candles bought on impulse during one of Melanie's emotional swings. The home had reshaped itself around her, as if finally it was no longer holding its breath. Helen woke early now, not out of anxiety but because she wanted to. She walked every morning at sunrise, through the quiet suburban streets where leaves crunched beneath her shoes, and no one demanded anything from her. She made breakfast slowly, steel-cut oats, fresh fruit, real coffee. No paper cups.
No rushing.
She didn't flinch when the doorbell rang. She didn't check her phone obsessively. She had nothing to hide, and no one to explain herself to anymore. Melanie hadn't contacted her in almost 3 months. The last attempt came in the form of a letter, handwritten, shaky, sent without return address. It wasn't angry. It wasn't exactly kind either. It was a performance of remorse without substance. Curtain call, perhaps. One final plea for sympathy dressed as reflection. "I guess you finally got what you wanted. A life without me. I hope it's as peaceful as you always imagined. I'm still struggling, but I guess that's what I deserve." Helen read it once, folded it in half, then placed it in a box labeled closure, along with other relics of the past she no longer needed to touch. She didn't respond. Her therapist once asked her if she wanted reconciliation, if she hoped Melanie might someday change. Helen thought about it for a long time, then said, "I don't know if she will. I don't know if I care anymore. I don't wish her harm. But I no longer owe her my life just because I gave her hers." There were still days when grief stirred, unexpected and sharp. At the grocery store, when she passed a mother and daughter laughing in the dairy aisle. At holidays, when the quiet in her house felt too heavy. But those moments no longer broke her. She let them pass like clouds over water. Temporary. Harmless. She began volunteering at a hospice. Not for distraction but because she had more to give, and finally she could give it without bleeding. She sat with people who were dying, who whispered secrets to her in the dark. She held hands, poured tea, adjusted blankets. There was something sacred in being useful again. In witnessing endings that, unlike her own, didn't require retaliation, only grace. She also started writing. First it was just journaling, but soon it became essays. Personal stories about care, about survival, about mothers who were more than martyrs. She submitted one to a local magazine. They published it with the title, "What We Don't Owe Our Children." The response was overwhelming. Letters from other women, other parents, some angry, most grateful. She wasn't alone. One afternoon she met an old friend for lunch. Someone she hadn't seen in years. Someone who had pulled away during the peak of Melanie's online accusations. They hugged, awkwardly at first and then truly. "I didn't know what to believe," the friend said, voice thick. I should have called.
I'm sorry.
Helen smiled. I'm not angry. I understand. I just moved on. And she had. Her life was smaller now intentionally. Quieter. She spent her evenings reading, learning how to paint landscapes, baking bread she shared with neighbors. Her world no longer revolved around chaos. And perhaps the most radical thing of all, she no longer looked at herself with shame. For years, she judged her reflection through her daughter's disappointment, had measured her worth by the gratitude or lack of it she received. Now, when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone who survived loving the wrong way, and finally learned how to stop. Not because she didn't love her daughter, but because she finally loved herself more. And that, Helen realized, was not failure. It was freedom. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to Betrayal and Revenge, give us a like, and hit the bell so you won't miss new tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. I value your feedback. See you in the next stories of Betrayal and Revenge.